Hi, everybody. This is Tracy Malone, and today we are going to talk with my friend Sheri Heller. Sheri is a therapist and an author, writer. She's got the most amazing blog on medium.com. We'll put the link down below, but today we are talking about self-blame after narcissistic abuse. So many victims struggle with, did I do something wrong? It's my fault. I shouldn't have done that. All of that self-blame is really the narcissist voice echoing in your head. And today, Sheri and I are going to discuss the evilness of the narcissist and the damage that it does to our soul when we are self-blaming ourselves. So let's go meet Sheri, and I'll see you on the other side. Welcome, Sheri. I am so glad to see you again. It is always a pleasure to see you. We're going to talk about self-blame and self-punishment when victims of abuse often just like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, or, if I had only, you experience clients with this sort of thing as well. Can we talk about self-blame and self-punishment?
Absolutely. I mean, this is where I find most of my clients get stuck. Even when they've gone no contact or they have very low contact, they ruminate. Some people can ruminate for years over what they did wrong. Even though they can delineate the most egregious, most disgusting forms of abuse, physical, emotional, psychological, they still want to retain a sense of the narcissist as someone who has an iota of humanity. It's very difficult to conceptualize someone as the embodiment of evil. I think this is where everything gets tripped up because they're scoffed at. I mean, I think on a cultural level, it's looked upon as being extremist. It's looked upon as, almost being like it's a mythic idea, human evil, although we all have the potential for human evil. When we talk about the malignancy of a narcissist, they are actually tactical and strategic with wanting to break someone down so that they can control them and dominate them. So being involved, of course, with the love bombing stage, the target is enraptured. And then there's that initial moment of being blindsided by something that seems completely out of left field. And that's where the breakdown begins. So we lead with this kind of moral imperative, what's called like a positivity bias, like a confirmation bias that, okay, something's happened. We need to work it through. I need to take accountability. We need to sort out whose property is whose. And that will strengthen our intimacy and that will resolve things. That is what puts the victim at risk with a narcissist, because the narcissist is never interested in accountability. What they're interested in is insinuating that the full responsibility resides in the issues or the insecurities of the target. The target is always responsible. And so there's something Vladimir Lenin said, the Russian politician, that repetitive lies eventually become truths. So when you're repetitively told that you've done something wrong, eventually you start believing it, and that's on the most kind of obvious baseline level of why the targets of supply assume blame in the relationship. It becomes more complicated when trauma bonding kicks in, pathological attachment. And that's where the power submission starts to really take hold, and to ward off the feelings of underlying terror that the supply really feels. They yield, they defer, they abdicate their perceptions. They actually develop cognitive dissonance, become extremely confused, because they're dealing with someone who is always mirroring back to them that they are not accurate with their perceptions. So there's a lot of gaslighting. actually setting them up to believe that what they thought was real wasn't real, that in fact they didn't say these things, or that never happened, or in fact this is what happened. And it's very calculated, and there are stages in the abuse in which the supply is isolated from supports. You know, and this is why it's so difficult for, I think, kind of people who have never been exposed to this kind of abuse to understand why the person who is victimized by the narcissist is so malleable, becomes so malleable. And unfortunately, many of the people who are formerly supports actually end up colluding with the narcissist.
What do you mean by colluding?
Well, I've had clients who've said, you know, who are going no contact, that someone, a friend of the narcissist, called them to remind them that it's the narcissist's birthday, or that they're concerned the narcissist is sad, that the supply, you know, is stepping away, or perhaps, you know, there'll be even more egregious, a smear campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that will come through the grapevine. So the victim, or the person, the survivor, really at that point is trying to extricate themselves, and now they have to deal with people condemning them behind their back.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that often will pull someone back in, because even just trying to redeem yourself becomes a form of supply for the narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bait.
Mm-hmm.
It baits the person back into the web. So the blame, I mean, becomes the locus of control. You know, I've got to look at, how do I regain agency? How do I regain power? How do I regain a sense of control amid this chaos? How do I establish some kind of order here? So we try to look at what is it about me characterologically? What is it about me behaviorally that is somehow contributing to this? Or, and that's the what did I do wrong? Or also, when I was when I used to work with rape survivors at a hotline with many years ago in New York, that was a very common symptom for survivors, and trying to gain a sense of control. I walked down the wrong street. I need better locks on my window, or was I so naive? And it is part of the process of really trying to regain some kind of stability. But with victims of narcissistic abuse, it can go on for years.
And that's the problem, is it's again, it's ingrained. I was just telling a group I worked with this morning, it's how our neurons are wired. If we look under the desk where our computer is, there's a whole lot of wires, right? And that's what your brain is. And so even though you can start to clear off and understand who they were, the recordings are still floating on those wires. And if we don't recognize them, they become imprinted on us, and we're doing it to ourselves, even though maybe the narcissist isn't here anymore. So
right.
Sort of self-blame can go on for years and years, even if you knew that the relationship was a bad one and that you don't want this person.
Yeah.
You still eat that for breakfast, you know,
Yeah.
and bring it into another relationship, or it morphs into your work life or other parts of your life, because that recording is just floating through the wires.
Yeah, and this is so true, especially for victims who had narcissistic parents, because they were groomed at such an early age. And as you said, that the term imprinting, to insinuate that one's attachment template becomes so mired in power and submission that a person doesn't even have rules of engagement or conditions. You know, I often ask people about, let's look at how you operate in the world. Would you treat someone like this? Would you, this is kind of what helped me recently with a situation I shared with you that I had, where I was blindsided by someone who I thought was a friend. And I had to ask myself, wait a second, I do not play these mind games. Why would I accommodate this?
Mhm.
but it's so almost natural to go back into, okay, if someone is saying they want to try to address an issue, and that's what a narcissist will do or an abuser will do, it feels like the right thing to do. It's a moral imperative. But it's so crucial to pull back and ask oneself, wait a second, what am I willing to accommodate? Would I expect someone to accommodate this in me? No, I wouldn't even act that way.
Mhm.
So it is almost having to get back to a place of remembering, wait, these are my standards. Standards get lost with trauma bonding.
Mhm.
Conditions, boundaries are completely lost
Mhm.
because the victim over identifies with the abuser in order to return to a state of false safety and false hope,
Mhm.
because it is too terrifying to recognize that you're involved with someone who is the embodiment of human evil. So this is where people, I think, I'd rather blame myself, essentially. This is what comes across to me with a lot of my clients who are stuck in this place. I'd rather blame myself than face that there is this kind of unpredictability and danger in the world, and that I was so close to it.
Yes.
Because when you really face it, it truly is horrifying. And as much as you try to understand it, as you were saying, like we all become detectives when we're victims of narcissistic abuse, you can't ever really quite understand it. I mean, as much as I understand it intellectually on a cerebral level, I have humanity. I have a moral compass. I can't imagine what it's like to not have that, to be so driven, to become dysphoric if I'm not able to dehumanize another human being. I
Mhm.
can't I can't really wrap my head around that.
Mhm.
Only on a very kind of cognitive level. But
Mhm.
certainly when you do connect with it emotionally, when you realize that you've been nothing but a pawn, that's where tremendous anxiety, panic, grief, rage kicks in.
Mhm. And the rage is sometimes so hard to let go of. Again, I've had people 10 years past their divorce and they're just seething inside because they haven't done the work to really tap into that and understand and maybe take some of the blame off themselves, because partially they are blaming themselves. How could I stay? How could I
Yeah,
not move? How could I have children with them? How could I? And
yeah,
that's keeping the rage fire going. But
right.
if you don't like let go and forgive yourself for those, I didn't know
Yeah, yeah,
and it will be part of your DNA to hold that rage for longer than you should.
right. Yeah, there's also the part of the rage, I think, is also the feelings of humiliation.
Mm.
And I hear that a lot, that going into sort of what Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, she talked about the compensation fantasy. Like, well, if I could see him suffer, I'll feel better. Or, if I knew that she was destitute, I'd feel better. So it gets into like these kinds of fixations on that's going to be the source of salvation, and it's not, because hate is a painful emotion to hold on to. It has to be assimilated, it has to be worked through. It's a organic response to unbelievable betrayal. But getting locked into it, I mean, it is, as you were saying, it is part of the self-blame. Okay, I'm going to blame them now. And, but it's still keeping that blame alive.
Mhm.
Hold them accountable. They're responsible, yes, but you do have to forgive yourself for being a mark. And anyone could be a mark for narcissistic abuse. Some people are more malleable than others. That's true. I think people who are groomed to abdicate the certain personal sense of agency, or who are exploited by parents, narcissistic parents, certainly are targets. But a narcissist loves a challenge. So, I mean, I shared with you, I have a client who's a police officer, a really, really incredibly smart, competent human being, a very caring human being, and he can't believe that he was targeted by this female narcissist. And just like everyone else, he's having to dismantle the trauma bond and to really break through the fog, the cognitive dissonance, and to reestablish a sense of stability in his life.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm always shocked by the unsuspectingness of the different types of victims. They are, when I thought of abuse growing up, I thought of someone with a black eye, a broken rib, and physical abuse. That's how I just, that's what I learned. I didn't know there was anything because I was living in a house with it. No one
Mm.
ever was going to teach me what it was. But
Yeah.
the reality is that I think this, and I've had people that have been punched and broken ribs, and they'd like, I'll take the broken rib over this emotional stuff, because
Yeah.
it really gets into your cells, and it again, it turns you into someone who would self-blame, someone who has no self-awareness because everything was lost from all of this abuse, and it's
Yeah.
insidious.
Yeah, and that's the end game. The end game is dehumanization, to reduce the person to nothing and then throw them away, but occasionally use them when on the narcissist whims. And the realization of that is incomprehensible. I think that's why a lot of people have Cassandra syndrome. They're not believed. They feel if they live in a world in which others are scoffing at the reality that's unfolding before them, then how do they believe their own pain? How do they validate their own suffering? And I mean, I think this is why survivors have to find each other in order to heal, because you can't explain this kind of psychological abuse. It is warfare. It is thought control. These are tactics that are learned in special forces. I mean, this is how the CIA, extracts information from people.
Mhm.
This is serious. I mean, it takes a kind of psychopathic mind to be able to break someone down to nothing.
Mhm.
And you think that looks a certain way. You think of, Charles Manson, or you think of someone who fits kind of a mold of what evil might look like, but it's not that at all. I mean, look at Ted Bundy, who is very charming, right? The serial killer running for Senate. And that's part of the self-blame as well. The impression management. Wait a second. No, this can't be possible. People like him. Or people, she's such a good mother on the outside. She's so polished, or she's goes to church. I mean, I have a client who told me about his parents who were constantly always in church, and his mother had marks on her neck. Of course, she would cover it up with a scarf from the father strangling her. She was also a narcissist as well, and they would deny it. It never happened.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we're looking now at, it is interesting because it's almost like, okay, there's a sense of truth. I know who this person is. They're not good people. But there isn't that sense of conviction that they're really bad people. It's this kind of mushy middle.
Yeah, and they have behind the diagnosis, whether they have one or not. Oh, it's because they're a narcissist, or it's because they're this, or
Yeah.
it's making that the excuse. There's no excuse for abuse, and yet when we're sitting here and we're justifying, a lot of times it has to do with, oh, well, I have compassion because they've got this illness and they just don't know how to love. No, that's a difference between not knowing how to love and knowing how to kill a soul.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people struggle with knowing how to love, sure, but that doesn't mean they don't have compassion or empathy. And I often talk about that too, with differentiating a narcissist from someone who has borderline pathology, because borderlines can also, out of a sense of severe abandonment, panic, and a need for control, do terrible things, but essentially have remorse. Although there are people with borderline pathology who also have comorbidity, who have severe narcissistic traits, or even MPD. The qualifier here is when someone really could care less, whether you're in pain or not,
Mhm.
whether you're suffering. And that is where I think, people get stumped when they say, as you were pointing out, well, it's a mental illness. It's like, look, this is a very surreal kind of mental illness. Sure, it's a mental illness. It's a spectrum disorder, but I think there was a lot of speculation with the APA, the American Psychological Association, with the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual, to assign narcissistic pathology to a spiritual disorder category.
Wow.
Because when we're talking about someone with MPD, it's a level of moral depravity. It's not just about not knowing how to love. They have no intention of loving. Loving is the idea of love. It's a tool to lure people in. It is designed because we essentially need love. I mean, one could say, well, at the core, the narcissist needs love. I mean, look, I used to think you could treat a narcissist in my naive days. I know that is such a dangerous mindset that maybe they can respond to some forms of operant conditioning that's used in prison systems, but you can't manufacture humanity that isn't there. You can't create a soul that isn't there. So, but even as I'm saying it, I can understand how people would look at me like, that's crazy. But that's what the victim has to come to in order to dismantle the blame, to dismantle the trauma bond, and to begin the work of complicated bereavement. Otherwise, they will stay in this place of self-condemnation forever.
So tell me, what is complicated bereavement? Because I know we talked about it before this, and I know a lot of people don't know. So can we share that? Because this is how we get out of this.
Right. So complicated bereavement is different than regular bereavement in that it is pertaining not just to the literal loss of a relationship in which one can never have closure, essentially, but the loss of self, the loss of personal dignity, the loss of safety, the loss of time, the loss of potentials. Many of my clients who say, wow, they were with someone during a period of their life where they were most capable of having children. They can't go back to that. There's financial loss. There's loss of, monetary assets. There is, it runs the gamut. But mostly it is a loss of self. There's a breakdown of self, especially if the abuse is so severe that one incurs not just complex trauma, but some people even have dissociative identity. People who I've worked with whose parents or involvement with family members or with spouses who are actually psychopaths, where the abuse was so extreme and so methodical and so diabolical that they just, there's a ruptured sense of who they are. So with complicated bereavement, there's a lot of trapped grief, a lot of trapped rage. There's a lot of denial that has to be worked through. And it's about assimilating everything that happened and creating a cohesive narrative so that one can first make sense out of what happened. And actually, in some, I guess, in a very literal way, grieve what died for them. Because there is a death, and in a way there's also a transformation, because in that place of defeat one recognizes that they were naive. They held on to naive beliefs about people that were all really indoctrinated to believe that everyone is good, that anything can be resolved, all things can be resolved, and that changes one's worldview. So there's even a death of a kind of innocence, or a sense of trust. Suddenly, one has to become more cynical after something like this, because they're
protection to become more cynical and less trusting. but at the same time, we still have to not give up all trust and
Absolutely.
under that umbrella, because that's another hellhole of I'll never trust again, and you limit your life because of this. Because if that happens, then the poison worked, right? Then they got
Right.
to that you're not going to live that life after them. And so building those things are important, but also guarding that trust and being
Yeah.
really mindful not to give it away again, like we probably did with the narcissist.
Yeah, that's so important, Tracy, the rebuilding that you yeah, that you retain a sense of faith in humanity. That there are people who are good, and unfortunately those people who are good are targeted by narcissists who want to usurp their light and covet what they have. Um it's almost like a fierce warrior type of thing. You know, I feel like we have to embody that part of that self, that archetype, where there is a sort of a retention of what we truly value, kindness, you know, and compassion and generosity, but recognizing that there is darkness in the world and that there are people in the world who are truly dangerous, and we need to protect ourselves from them.
We really do. This has been so enlightening. Did we miss anything?
You know, I think we've covered basically everything. I think I guess the one thing I want to say, which is something you and I have talked about, I wish more clinicians were able to reflect these truths back to victims who come to them on the heels of this kind of abuse, because so often I encounter victims who are seeking recovery, who say that they've been re-traumatized by being told that they are just extremist in their views, or that they're because they're so symptomatic also, they are often misdiagnosed,
Mm.
you know, with character pathology themselves. Because the fragmentation really is so unsettling that it does create such a mass array of symptomology. And I think this is so important for clinicians to look at.
It would help so many people, because I too have those stories, and the the non-belief, and it's a different love language, and while that's all fluffy and nice, and I'm all in favor of love languages, when you're dealing with that evil, when you're dealing with someone who has no empathy for you and is willing to do anything to destroy you,
Yeah.
love languages don't play that game. Like, it's like, do you like gifts or do you like this?
Yeah.
Totally different things. And that really messes them, because then the victim is going, oh, did I do something wrong? Why was he or she so mean? And and they put the blame back on themselves,
Yeah.
because if I had only known their love language, then they would be different. No, they won't. You can't make an orange become an apple. It just
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. All right,
absolutely.
last question for you. Tell people how they can learn more about you. I am going to put the link to your website down below, as well as the link to this article on medium.com, which is
Yeah, wonderful.
amazing. And like, I want everyone to read it. It is highlighted, half the paper ran out of ink in my highlighter because it was so good. So tell us where they can find you.
Please go to my website at sheritherapist.com. I spell my name Sheri. I am now in Montreal, Canada. I'm a recent transplant from New York City, and I am actually putting together a group for survivors of narc abuse in Montreal. So I would love to work with people here, as well as continue working with people in the States and everywhere. So I'd love to hear from you.
Nice. Well, everybody, please check out her stuff. Check out her work. I mean, her Medium blogs are so powerful, that she's got one, and you've got it on our site too, called The Denial of Evil. I'll actually put that link in here too, because it's exactly what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And it was about the psychological world not seeing and witnessing and understanding that this evil, that it does exist. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. It was great to
Sure, Tracy. Great to see you. Bye.
Well, I hope you guys found that helpful. Sheri is a wealth of information. As I said, I will put the link in the show notes down below for her Medium blog. Please go read the one that we're talking about self-blame and self-punishment. If you are struggling with this recordings in your head or putting yourself down, these are not things you need to hold. You need to learn to let go and learn to know that this wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, and if you did, stay too long, had children with them, whatever it was that you're blaming yourself for, let that go. You didn't know what a narcissist was. You stayed for the children. You had reasons. And so if you can forgive yourself, it's one less attachment to all of that self-blame. So this is Tracy Malone. I'm the founder of NarcissistAbuseSupport.com. If you've made it this far and you like my video, please click like or subscribe, and we will see you again soon. Thank you so much.